right, so I think this is where we left off on chapter 11. Chapter 11 is really our introduction to resource markets, resources, the things that we use to produce final goods and services. And so this is a unique perspective on markets in that it's the market in which you and I are the suppliers and firms are the ones that demand the resources from households, really. And the primary resource we all have to sell is labor, so it is the one that really makes for the best examples, which holds true for this chapter. And then you're going to see as we transition into chapter 12 today that we really talk about labor and the labor resource in even more detail, because it's this very finicky resource. It's this very particular resource that has feelings, that thinks about the choices it wants to make with the resource, basically the time that we have. And so we have to take that resource even one step further in the next chapter, which you'll see. But I think this is where we left off. And we left off talking about marginal revenue product, which is this new concept, this new calculation, if you will, that isn't really difficult to understand, but it really sets us up for being able to determine where we profit maximize from the resource perspective, which is sort of a totally different perspective than we've been looking at so far, okay? So the marginal product of a resource is the additional production we get out of that additional unit of a resource. And so it's important to know how much additional production we're going to get out of that resource. We actually went through and did an example when we were talking about the cooks in the pizza kitchen or the movers with the Smoother Mover Corporation. We talked about how if we hired one more person, what we could expect that that person would contribute to the overall production. So it's important to understand what the difference in product you're going to get from that additional unit of resource. Now you could do this with a barrel of oil or a truckload of lumber, whatever. You could do the same thing. Our example is going to be labor, but you could do the same exact analysis. As a matter of fact, if you were really doing this, we've simplified this for you. You would think about all of your resources and you'd actually try and figure this out with all of your resources, okay? But in this case, we're focused on labor as our primary and maybe even only variable resource. So a firm's demand for a resource starts by figuring out what the marginal product of each unit of that resource is going to be. So how much will each person contribute to production? And then even more importantly, because we've already talked about marginal product, is that bottom piece, and that's your marginal revenue product. Now that you know how much additional production you're going to get out of each unit of, in this case, your labor resource, this takes that a step further and says, what can we sell that product for? How much additional revenue are we going to get because of that additional production? And that's the marginal revenue product. Kind of what it sounds like. Marginal additional revenue, well, that's the money coming in the door. Product, well, that's your production. So the additional money coming in the door from production, okay, is the change in total revenue when an additional unit of a resource is employed. So we're going to look at a couple of charts here that I think will help bring that to light. This first one is a chart based on data from a competitive market. And I can actually tell by looking at that column 4 where the price is $20, no matter how many units I sell, I know that this is actually a perfectly competitive market, most likely, because we're looking at a price taker. We're looking at someone who's given a price and then can sell as many units as they want to at that price. And so let's look at the different columns here. Column number 1 is going to be workers per day. You can see 0 through 8. The total product, how much total production do we get out of that combination of workers? Remember that the marginal product here in column 3, that's not a reflection of the quality of that worker. That's a reflection of the team of workers, right? because we can't actually, I mean, in some cases you can, but a lot of times you can't actually say that person produced that unit, because usually we've done some division of labor, right? We've created some sort of an assembly line, if you will, and we usually don't have somebody produce a good really from start to finish. So you can't really pinpoint who made which good as much as they contributed as a team to this production in most cases, okay? So you have the marginal product, the additional production. You can see that that number goes down. The more workers we employ, the more we produce because of diminishing marginal returns. Something we already talked about, right? We talked about the cooks in the pizza kitchen, and that as we added more cooks, right? Sometimes, right, it ramped up production initially, but then it was usually going to end up tapering off. So in this case, it looks like it tapers off. We don't really get a huge ramp up in production. We do from 0 workers to 1 worker. Sometimes we do get that little bump up, but looks like in this case, we actually did it. And then the total revenue is the total product. So column 2 times the price, which is going to be $20 no matter how much we produce. And so in the case of 1 worker, it's the 10 times the 20. In the case of 2 workers, it's 19 times 20, so on and so forth. And then the marginal revenue product, you can actually calculate a couple different ways. You can actually see what the change in total revenue is. So when we're going from 200 to 380 in column 5, we can see that that change was 180. And so there in column 6 is that 180. Or you can multiply the marginal product of 9 times the price of 20, and you get that same 180. So it's just a different way of going about the math, but pretty much the same thing. So you can see that your marginal revenue product, because your marginal product is on the decline, your column 3 is on the decline, you would expect column 6 to actually decline as well, because you're at a pretty steady rate, because your the price of the product is staying the same, but your marginal product is decreasing. So you can see how much additional revenue, how much additional money would be coming in the door there in column 6 with each additional worker employed. Now, the next thing we're going to have to do, and we're going to do it, is figure out how much that resource is costing us so that we can compare how much that resource brings in versus how much that resource actually takes out or costs us in terms of expenses. But you can see that if you're looking at this marginal revenue product and you know that it costs you $100 a day to employ each of these workers, you know you don't want worker 7 or 8 because they're only bringing in $80 or $60. Not them specifically, but the addition of them to the team. And so clearly, right, if they cost you 100 and they bring in 80 or 60, those aren't units you're going to want, right? That's not a resource you're going to want to employ. So it's looking at profit maximization from sort of the other side, from the resource perspective. All right, so just to show you the difference between a firm in a perfectly competitive market structure that would have been a price taker to what our numbers might look like in the instance of a price maker. So a firm with market power, which could be in monopoly, it could be monopolistic competition, it could be oligopoly, depending on whether it's differentiated or not. But we're talking about a price maker in this case, a firm who is facing a downward sloping demand curve. Now, the reason I say downward sloping demand curve is because that would tell me that the more I wanted to sell, the lower the price would have to be. I have some influence over price, right? And I know that if I want to sell more, I got to bring the price down because that's what the demand curve says I have to do. Okay, that downward sloping demand curve. And so you can see we have the same information in columns 1 and 2. We have workers per day, and we actually have the same total product, right? Those are the same numbers. But you can see here's where it starts getting different, is when we get to column 3, the product price, you can see the product price starts really high and then goes down as we want to sell more and more units. Total revenue, we got it the same way. We just multiplied 2 and 3. Okay. And then the marginal revenue product, how much additional revenue, how much additional product are we making? How much is the price per product? And then doing the multiplication to come up with the change in revenue. Okay. You can see that as compared with the previous chart of information, our marginal revenue starts out much higher on these first units, right? We go back, you see we started at 200 and then went to 180. You can see here we start at 400 and go to 265. So we started with very high marginal revenue product, but then it goes bad very quickly. If we were paying labor $100 per day on here, you can see I wouldn't want 5, 6, 7, or 8, right? Because their marginal revenue product is less than $100, and in some cases is even negative. So I know I don't want them. So this just goes to show you, to illustrate once again, that when we have competition in the market, you and I get more of everything, right, at a lower price. In the case of a firm with market power, which is what we're looking at here, they're not going to employ as much of a resource. It means they're probably not going to make as much product, okay? And they're going to sell it at a higher price, and that's not good for us as consumers, right? Okay, and so it really all comes down to this. Okay, we calculated marginal revenue product, the additional revenue we got from production for each additional unit of a resource, in this case, labor. When we compare that to the marginal resource cost, I threw a number of $100 out there, right? But you'd actually need to know what your resource cost would be. Your marginal resource cost, the change in total cost when an additional unit of a resource is employed. So that was that $100 a day that I was talking about in the previous charts. And so doing a comparison between the marginal revenue product of a resource and the marginal resource cost of a resource can actually help you determine profit maximization, but from a different perspective, from a resource perspective. If you look at that second bullet point, maximize profit, minimize loss. And then you look at what's underneath it. If you look closely, you can actually see MR equals MC in there, right? It just is from a resource perspective. So MR is marginal revenue product. So it's about the revenue just from that additional production, right? Equals marginal resource costs. There's your MC, your marginal cost, but here we're talking about resource costs, right? And so where marginal revenue product is equal to marginal resource cost, it's another way for us to find our profit maximizing, but in this case, our profit maximizing level of a resource. So kind of the same analysis, just a slight difference in that we're just not looking at straight numbers. We're actually, of final goods and services, we're looking at it from the other end, the resource. So if you look at these graphs right here, this first graph is for the market. You can see it says market. Here we're talking about the market for a certain type of labor. So, I mean, in this case, we end up with an equilibrium in this market of $100 per day. Well, what kind of labor is that? You know, that's unskilled labor. You know, that's $12.50 an hour or something like that. So we're talking about essentially minimum wage labor in most cases. And so this is unskilled labor. But the market usually determines what the going rate is for labor. Now, we know that with actual minimum wage, that we actually have, right, a price floor above equilibrium, if we think back to chapter 4, that doesn't let the actual equilibrium rate be achieved because the government comes in and imposes that sort of artificial floor. But even in a natural market, right, where we don't have a minimum wage or that isn't subjected to minimum wage, like skilled labor, like if you have a skill, you're usually not going to make minimum wage, right? What you're going to make is some equilibrium rate for that, whatever that particular type of labor is. But in this case, we've come up with a per day rate, equilibrium rate of $100. So then if you look at the graph on the right, what this is showing you is that you can have as much of that labor as you want at $100. So basically, if $100 is the going rate for some type of labor, that's what you're going to have to pay for it. So if you're buying it as a firm, you're buying it at $100. So what you see there, that perfectly horizontal line at $100, is the marginal resource cost. What's the additional cost associated with each unit of a resource, in this case, workers per day, labor. And then that downward sloping curve basically ends up being your resource demand curve for your firm, because it's based on how much revenue that resource is bringing in. Well, remember, a resource's demand is derived on what that resource produces. So this sort of brings that full circle in that marginal revenue product becomes resource demand because it is the production that a resource does for you that actually determines how much you want of it. Okay, so this is just the marginal revenue product for one of those firms that we looked at in the previous chart, right? It was the marginal revenue product was going down anyway. This actually looks like maybe this was the second one, the firm with market power, because remember I said you wouldn't want to hire any more than 6 units of that labor, because at $100, right, they didn't even make back what you were paying to buy them. And so you can see here at 6 workers per day is where you sort of hit your equilibrium of sorts, and that would be your profit maximizing level of resource, would be 6 workers per day. Okay, you can see that after that point, after 6, your marginal revenue product lies below your marginal resource cost. That's bad business. Even worker number 6 themselves is just bringing in what we're paying them. They're a wash. I mean, maybe if it's like your cousin or your brother-in-law, or you know what I mean? But the fact is, even worker number 6 is a take it or leave it kind of situation. I mean, if you want to employ one more person, good for you, but they're actually just bringing in the revenue that offsets the cost that you're incurring by employing them. All right, so sort of the last slide to wrap up resource markets in general is talking about the changes in resource demand. Now, there are 3 primary things that would change the demand for a resource. The first is the change in other resources employed. Here we're talking about substitution. We know that if firms find a substitute resource, just like if you and I find a substitute good, we're going to substitute the cheaper one in and substitute the more expensive one out. The same goes for resources. So as firms discover new resources, as the prices of other resources change, that clearly can shift the demand curve for other substitute resources in the market. The second one, and this is big, especially for labor, is changes in technology. So a change in technology is going to increase the demand for technology, but a lot of times technology makes us more efficient. And that means we need less of the other resources. Like technology becomes the big resource that we're using. And so usually with technology, we need fewer people and we need higher skilled people to replace those that were doing the job that the technology or the machines are now doing. We now need someone to run the machine, not someone to do the job the machine's doing, but someone to manage the machine itself, the technology itself. And so we need higher skilled workers. And so changes in technology is going to change your demand for like low trained labor and increase your demand for higher skilled labor. It also makes us more efficient with other resources. So using technology can also help us use less energy, use less of our, whatever our raw materials are, our natural resources. It can also make us more efficient that way, and then we just don't need as many, okay? And the last one, because of that derived demand concept, if no one is demanding the final goods and services that these resources go into producing, then we don't need the resource anymore. Or vice versa, right? If demand really picks up for a product, then we might need to employ more resources. And we see this happen all the time, right? You and I decide we need something, stores run out of it, and they quickly try and find more resources to respond to our demand for the final goods and services. And so they're going to ramp up their demand for the resources necessary, or vice versa, right? If we decide we don't want it anymore. Any questions about the resource market before we move on to a very specific segment of the resource market, which is human labor? Everybody good on this? Okay, so let me pull up the chapter 12 PowerPoint and we'll get started on that. Okay, so chapter 12 is going to focus on labor markets and labor unions. Labor markets is really what we're going to get covered today, and then labor unions is what we're going to start on Monday. Labor market, because we're talking about people are somewhat unpredictable, and people have 24 hours in a day. That's all they have. People need to sleep, people need to eat, people physically break down, people have emotions, people have health issues. Because the labor market is made up of people, it's a very finicky market. We employ people in a department called human resources just to try and manage this finicky resource, right? You don't have any of those same problems with a truckload of lumber or steel or whatever. You have some logistical issues. You got to get it on a truck and get it to you. That's it. Labor, it changes its mind. It has weird behaviors. And so we're going to talk about some of the biggest sort of differences between labor markets and the labor supply versus the supply of other resources. You know it's different, right? It's you and me. So labor supply. Individuals have a labor supply curve for each possible use of your time. We divide the use of your time into 3 basic categories. Okay, these could be broken down even more, but 3 basic categories for the sake of this chapter. The first is market work. Market work is going to be you selling your labor as a resource to the market. The second one is going to be non-market work. This is stuff we typically don't enjoy doing that we do for ourselves that we would consider work. So things like cleaning, cooking, driving, whatever, right? doing your laundry. A lot of that household production stuff we call non-market work, yard work, whatever. If you enjoy any of those things, probably wouldn't put it in non-market work. We probably put it in leisure. But leisure is really going to be anything that falls outside market or non-market work. So things you do for fun, things you do when you have the choice, when you have free time, what you do. Now, I would also put sleep, right? Probably in leisure. You know, it's a basic human need. So, but I would put it under leisure because some people need more, some people need less, some people simply like it, okay? So because we only have 24 hours in a day, we have to allocate that 24 hours between these three uses. And how we allocate it is very subjective, is very personal, right? And is divided up for our own particular reasons and satisfaction, okay? So that brings us to utility maximization, which is our number one incentive. We talked about this in chapter 6 when we talked about utility. Satisfaction is that you spend money, every penny really, in order to maximize your utility or your satisfaction from that money. And we talked about pizzas and movies and consumer equilibrium, and we talked about all this stuff. This is almost the same. But instead of figuring out how you're going to spend your money to maximize your satisfaction, now it's about how you spend your time to maximize your satisfaction. And part of that time can be spent doing market work, which is going to give you money, which you can spend to get more satisfaction. Okay? But then we have non-market work and leisure that don't really earn us money, but still are a part of that satisfaction equation. Okay? So work and utility. Work has increasing marginal disutility. Disutility, dissatisfaction. This would basically imply that the more you work, the more you don't want to work. So when you get to your 50th hour a week or your 60th hour a week, or for some of you, it's even your 30th or your 40th hour of work a week, you begin to feel dissatisfied with each additional hour worked. I think this is generally true. I think even with people who love their jobs, there probably is a point of critical mass where they just need time off, right? And so that brings us to a concept called the net utility of work, which is basically the utility or the satisfaction you get from the stuff you can buy with the additional pay, minus your dislike for the additional work, for those additional hours you've had to work, that sense of dissatisfaction from losing that time, essentially, or using that time to work. The net utility of work is an equation, right? It's not an equation that we write down on paper. It's something that happens in our brains. And your brain knows how much you like your job or hate your job. Your brain knows how badly you need to do laundry. Your brain knows how badly you need a vacation or a day off or a mental health day or whatever, right? And so this net utility of work thing is something that happens inside your head, right? Very efficiently, and it looks different for every single one of us. And so when we talk about utility maximization from the resource perspective, it's not about spending money, right? It's about allocating time. Some of that time is going to earn you money, which is going to take us back to chapter 6. But right here, we're just talking about your time. You allocate your time between those three uses, market work, non-market work, and leisure, so that the expected marginal utility, the expected additional satisfaction of the last minute spent on each activity is identical. So this is, again, that consumer equilibrium, right? Where we talked about the pizza in the movies. It's the same thing, except for instead of spending money, you're spending time. And you're spending time allocated over basically free uses. Where when you spend money, you're really talking about hundreds or even thousands of different goods we just limit it to 3, at least for the sake of this class, okay? A higher wage equals a higher opportunity cost of leisure or non-market work. The more money you make, really the harder it is to justify leisure or non-market work to an extent, okay? This is why people who make very high incomes, very high wages, pay other people to do non-market work for them. Is because when they weigh those things, when they say, well, I could go perform brain surgery, or I could go, design a building or whatever, and I could make $500 an hour doing that, and I could pay somebody $20 to mow my lawn or whatever, right? A couple $100 to clean my house, whatever it is. And so when I compare those two, right? Because my high wage has such a high opportunity cost, chances are I'm going to pay people to do my non-market work for me. Because I don't want to pay people to do my leisure for me, right? I want my leisure myself. And so the more money you make, the less time you spend on non-market work, and typically, at least in the beginning, the more time you spend on your market work. That brings us to the exception, okay? And it brings us to the labor supply curve. Up until this point, when we were in chapter 11, we talked about an upward sloping supply curve for resources, just like we would expect in any market for goods and services, whatever. The labor supply curve is a little tricky because remember, labor only has so many hours, right? It's in finite supply. We each have 24 hours a day, and there are X number of people in the workforce in our country. So at some point, we run out of labor. And actually, pre-COVID, we'd pretty much done that. We had pretty much exhausted all of the labor in the United States. We were at, from an economic perspective, what we would consider full employment, which meant we had a few percent unemployment, right? But that's to be expected because we have all those sources of unemployment, right? Or we have different sources of unemployment, but 3% is about full employment. That's as good as it gets for us, right? And so pre-COVID, we had exhausted our labor supply. The labor supply is tricky. Your particular labor supply and the labor supply overall. Because of something we call the substitution effect of a wage increase and the income effect of a wage increase. What this says is if you imagine a supply curve upward sloping, as the wages go up, you give more hours, right? Price and quantity move in the same direction with an upward sloping supply curve. What this would say, what this would suggest is the substitution effect of a wage increase, which means that you will substitute as you get higher and higher and higher wages, you will substitute in market work and substitute out those other two activities, leisure, non-market work. You pay people to do the non-market work for you, likely, and then you might get less time off, less leisure, right? Because you're earning that high wage and that motivates you. But then something typically happens at a threshold that is different for every single one of us at different points in our life. And that is something we call the income effect of a wage increase, which says that there comes a point for all of us where we're increasing wages, giving more hours, increasing wages, giving more hours, and we say, we don't want to give any more hours. Actually, the more you give me from this point forward, the less hours I'm gonna work, the less hours I feel like I need to work, right? I want some of my life back. I'm just not gonna give you 23 hours of every day. I want my life back, right? I wanna do other things that are important to me. I wanna have leisure activities, whatever. And for a lot of us, or at least my experiences, this happens with age, right? This happens as you reach sort of that 40 to 50-year-old range in your life where you're like, I've been working for 20, 30 years. It's time to, as I make more money, I'm going to allow myself to essentially buy back some of my leisure. And so this income effect of a wage increase begins to offset that substitution effect. Your brain actually switches and you're like, I'm not necessarily motivated by more money as much as if you actually give me more money, I'm going to work less because I perhaps don't need to work as much, and I'm ready to let this income effect switch or offset the substitution effect. Now, this assumes that the number of hours you work is flexible. And that is an assumption that your author has you make. And his argument is that a lot of times we do have flexibility in the number of hours worked. Sometimes we don't, right? But overall, typically we do. If we want to pick up extra hours, if we want to make a couple extra sales calls, usually we can do that, or typically we could cut back too and let somebody else take those hours. So but it does assume that flexibility. And so that takes us to what we call the backward bending labor supply curve. As wages rise, the substitution effect comes into play, and we have that upward sloping supply curve. And then once the income effect of a price, so our wages still going up, will actually begin to decrease the supply. We'll actually begin to decrease the quantity of hours we're willing to give. I'll show you that here in a minute, okay? So as wages rise, the actual quantity of labor supplied will eventually decline. It happens to all of us at different points. The income effect of a higher wage increases the demand for leisure. We begin to, want to substitute leisure back. We've been working hard for a lot of years. We want to get some leisure back. And this income effect eventually offsets that substitution effect, and the labor supply backward bends. Okay, so let me show you an example of that real quick. Now, I think these are kind of weird numbers for your author to have used, but whatever. He may have even been, his example may have been like college students. I don't know. I can't remember exactly. But you can see how initially at $7 an hour, that's probably still minimum wage someplace, you can see that we have an upward sloping supply curve. So as this particular person gets increases of $1 per hour, they're willing to give more and more hours to the market. That's the substitution effect of a wage increase. And then you can see they hit that $12 an hour, and it creates a point of pivot. That's the magic number in their head, right? For whatever reason, it doesn't matter. But they decide that for every dollar above and beyond 12, they're actually going to start decreasing the number of hours, because they can afford to, because they're getting a higher wage per hour, right? So they can actually work less hours and not lose as much income. And they've just made a decision that they want to get some leisure back in their life after working 60 hours a week at $12 an hour, okay? Again, completely subjective, happens at a different place for everybody. But it's a phenomenon you need to understand. There will likely be an exam question. All right, so other than wage, there are things that we do come into consideration when we think about your labor supply curve. The first is going to be other sources of income. It's not all about the money for people that have other sources of money. People that have trust funds, people that have investments, people that have rental income, Social Security, pensions, whatever, are going to have other sources of income, and that is going to be a huge factor in their labor supply curve and what it looks like. Non-monetary factors. What would you say would be some non-monetary factors? For some reason, I am having trouble seeing my chat. Somebody just tell me. What are some non-monetary factors that would determine how much you would supply to the workforce? I need somebody to chime in.
Your health.
Beautiful. Your health, the health of those around you, right? Do you have a sick partner, a sick child, a sick parent, whatever? That's going to be huge. What else?
Like how busy you are, like if you have other priorities and you have other things to be doing.
Perfect. What are your priorities? Do you have other more important things to do? Again, this could come back to like, are you caring for a sick relative? Are you opening up, trying to open a business of your own? Are you getting an education? Like, are there other things that you deem more important? That is a non-monetary factor, at least at this point, right? But it also could be things like, is it a dangerous job, right? Is it a disgusting job? All of those are going to determine how much labor you're willing to supply to that particular job as well, right? The value of the job experience. There are some of you who are going to take internships that pay you little, sometimes nothing, and you're going to be willing to supply labor because you value the job experience, because you think that experience later on down the line will increase your wages or will give you a foot in the door or whatever, increase your job opportunities in the future. But right now, you might be giving your labor to that market for free or significantly discounted. The other thing is your taste for the work. If you love what you do, you're probably not going to backward bend nearly as soon, right? To me, backward bending isn't about a certain income threshold. It might be. I think it would have to be pretty high, as much as it's about the point in your life that you're at, whatever that means, right? But your taste for the work, if you love your job, you're likely willing to give more hours to it. If you hate your job, it's going to be the opposite, obviously. All right, so let's look at these individual labor supply curves. So worker B, and worker C are three individuals that make up this labor market, whatever it is. You can see that those are very different labor supply curves. And you can see that worker A actually has already started to backward bend. They've already seen the income effect offset the substitution effect. The other two are still sort of on an upward trajectory, right? A forward trajectory, except for, can you see that those do begin to head, a labor supply curve tends to head more vertical in the end because you run out of time. Do you see that x-axis, the quantity, that's the quantity of your labor. Well, your labor is restricted to 24 hours a day. And you can't work 24 hours a day every day, right? So you physically begin to run out of quantity. And so that's why at some point, right, it begins to take this really vertical pitch and then will usually end wherever you've run out of labor, right? And then here's your market supply. You can see your market supply is still upward sloping, right? Because overall, you're still going to get labor between the three of these folks. You're still going to get labor, but worker number one is going to backward bend, okay? And even the market supply curve does tend to start to run vertical because at some point your market is going to run out of labor too. At some point, all three of those workers are going to be maxed out and you simply cannot get another minute out. Okay? It's just like any other market supply curve. It's a sum of the individuals in that market. Okay, why wages differ. I know there's additional reasons why wages differ. I do know that. But here are really the big, maybe more tangible reasons why we see wages differ. The first is going to be training. If we train somebody to be more valuable, to do a higher value function, we can justify paying them more. If we pay the person that used to sit on an assembly line to run the machine that now runs the assembly line, well, that's a higher value function. We can typically justify paying them more. Education, huge is education. We actually find that when we are trying to move people from the lowest paying households, the lowest income earning households in the US, to one of the highest earning households, the number one thing that can move you, even if you're, because we're all born into, right? We're all born into a household of a certain income level. And the biggest thing that we can do to go from a low earning household to a high earning household is to get a 4-year education. That's the number one factor in that bump. So that's, I mean, I don't know why I didn't put that one first, right? Because that might be the most, I don't want to say important, but the biggest, the factor with the biggest impact. Age is going to be another one, and age can go either way, actually. Yeah, usually with older age comes more experience, and that usually gets you more money because age many times equals experience, especially years in age, like older ages equal experience. But young people have their advantages too, right? There are certain jobs, certain functions for young people, and a lot of times it has to do with physical ability, right? Just being in your physical prime, that a lot of those types of jobs would probably pay more money to someone who's younger rather than someone who's older. Your ability, again, this could be your physical ability, which ties it back to age, but it could be your mental capacity, right? What is your capacity for the job? Risk factors, we know that we have to pay people more money to do risky jobs. Geographic differences, this is an interesting one. So this could be geographic differences just between different locations within the United States, or it can be geographic differences across the world. And we're actually going to start Monday's lecture with a video on sweatshops because I think it's a very important thing we need to talk about when we talk about labor resources. But clearly, there are people doing the same job in other parts of the world who are making pennies on the dollar compared to what Americans are earning doing the same or similar jobs, right? So geographic differences in and of themselves, but in different places in the US, you have to pay different based on cost of living in that particular area. So somebody doing the same job in, you know, Nebraska versus LA, right? You're probably going to need to pay a different wage for the same job. And then discrimination is going to be the last one. And that can be all sorts of discrimination. We know that women make, 72 cents on the dollar compared to men for the same job. This can be racial discrimination based on sexual orientation, based on religion, any of those things. Clearly that is subjective based on the person who has control over wages and what kind of discrimination they are using to make that determination. Okay? All right, I know time's up.